Who was the first man to ever set foot on the moon, and when did he do that? Neil Armstrong touched the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969. Easy as pie, right? But do you know who was the last man to do so? That's Gene Cernan. He stepped off the silver plate in December 1972. Wait, 1972? No Earthlings have visited the home of Diana ever again for 50 years. Yeah, that's true. NASA never returned to the moon, and these are the reasons why. The space race is over. Before getting to know why the moon's soil has remained untouched for 5 decades, let's turn back the clock to the 1950s to see why it got the first hello. It was a cold era. No, I do not mean the temperature. Across the 50s and 60s, the USA and USSR were the two most powerful political entities in the world, and they were battling in what's now referred to as the Cold War. They were chasing each other in the arms race. Their arsenals were full of nuclear weapons. Thankfully, the world was spared from witnessing these catastrophic instruments of annihilation unleashed upon humanity. But they'd spent billions and couldn't let their rockets go to waste. Both the two leading powers in the bipolar world at the time came up with this idea, relocating the rocket scientists to work on spaceflight. The space race was on. In 1957, the Soviets launched the first satellite into orbit and sent the first animal into space. In 1959, Luna 2 of the USSR was the first spacecraft to strike the moon. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first ever man to journey into outer space. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova made her reputation as the first woman to leave Earth. With the USSR taking such a huge lead, the biggest brains of America were in urgent need of finding a way to catch up and then surpass their Soviet counterparts. Their target was the moon. Yeah, sure, Luna 2 touched that ground, but none of the Soviets had traveled there. Sending a man to the moon would level the game for the US. The government was obsessed. In 1966, they allocated $5.9 billion to that mission. That's around $43 billion nowadays. Of course, the whole moon landing plan received heavy criticism. So as soon as Apollo 11 successfully brought Armstrong to the moon, declaring the US as the winner of the space race, the government rushed to find excuses to ditch the project. They knew if they didn't, they would soon go bankrupt. So, in fact, NASA has never lost interest in exploring our only satellite. They just lost the financial aid from the state to do so. While NASA's total budget for 2022 was just $24 billion, it's shared between multiple divisions and projects. 14 Apollo missions that were launched cost around $162 billion, if you didn't know. Political instability doesn't support moon landing projects. Who is the president of the USA has a lot to do with the moon landing projects. The process of designing, engineering, and testing a spacecraft that could get people to another world easily outlasts a 2-term president. The next one in the chair usually ditches the previous leader's space exploration priorities. You see the problem? Ongoing projects could get cancelled any time. In fact, NASA really did have intentions to return to the moon once again. They launched a revitalized moon initiative called Constellation Program in 2005, but President Obama scrapped it in 2011 and signed off on the SLS rocket instead. When it was Trump's turn to sit in the chair, he shifted priorities to the moon and Mars missions. Such frequent changes to NASA's expensive priorities have led to cancellation after cancellation, a loss of about $20 billion, and years of wasted time and momentum. The real driving force behind that government commitment to return to the moon is the will of the American people. But public interest in lunar exploration has always been lukewarm. Even at the height of the Apollo program, after Aldrin and Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, only 53% of Americans said that they thought the program was worth the cost. The rest found it just a meaningless competition between American and Soviet leaders. Most of the remaining time, US approval of Apollo doesn't go past 50%. Plus, returning to the moon and sending people there again are often two different things. Insider conducted a poll in December 2018, and more than 57% of nationwide respondents believed NASA should prioritize going back to the lunar land, but only 38% thought that living, breathing humans needed to be in charge. The rest said robots could do the task for us easily. NASA has its own problems. The Americans have never been really crazy about traveling to the moon, but that's relatively alarming these days. Today, kids want to be YouTube stars rather than astronauts. The average age of the people in mission control for Apollo 13 was 26 years old, and they were experienced ones who had already been on a bunch of missions. For things like moon landing projects, we need young people. I mean, teenagers and 20-year-olds. They're the ones with the most enthusiasm, and that's where innovation comes from. When Elon Musk landed a rocket booster, his whole company was yelling, screaming, and jumping up and down due to excitement. That's the kind of energy needed to keep going. Sadly, NASA's workforce is graying. Now, the average age of workers at NASA's Johnson Space Center is closer to 60 years old. They're basically grandpas. While their knowledge is immense, they don't have youngsters' drive to go on. Do they really need to? Don't get it wrong. Just because NASA stopped sending astronauts to the moon doesn't mean they no longer study it. 60 years ago, space was the target destination of only the USA and USSR. But things have changed so much since then. Japan joined the game in 1990, and that was followed by the European Space Agency, India, and China. Space has become an international mission instead of remaining a competition. Nations collaborate rather than compete. Nowadays, many probes and rovers are wandering in the Silver Land. They're cost-effective. They don't need food, water, or oxygen. They don't need to sleep, and they aren't subjective. They've collected and sent back to Earth a sizable amount of data. So, even though NASA no longer sent men to the moon, they still have stuff to work with. Photos, rock samples, just to name a few. There's a new race. We've known the existence of the moon for millennia. That's why it was the first target in the space race. But now it seems quite close and somewhat familiar. There are other, seemingly more interesting destinations. NASA's sight has geared towards another prospect, Mars. The Mars race seems to have been forming slowly over time. The difference is that this time it's not really a competition among nations. NASA is competing with manufacturers such as SpaceX of Elon Musk and Boeing. Blue Origin has also stated that they attempt to land on Mars, suggesting that this could turn into a commercial competition soon. NASA has already sent probes and rovers to the Red Planet. In fact, that takes up a huge share of the annual budget of NASA, making the return to the moon less possible. Perhaps they just couldn't. The fact that NASA hasn't touched the lunar soil again for more than 5 decades has raised a huge amount of suspicion. Some people believe that moon landings actually never happened in the first place. They think NASA just faked the whole scene to trick the world into believing the US was superior to the USSR. And their doubts indeed make sense to a certain extent. Take a look at this. You see what's abnormal? Shadows in the moon landing photos aren't parallel. The only light source of the moon is the sun, so shadows should have been parallel. The fact that they aren't has some people wondering if the photo was indeed taken inside a studio, where there were indeed multiple light sources. Moreover, this photo shows the US flag waving. But was it possible? We know that the moon, unlike our Earth, doesn't have an atmosphere. No atmosphere means there's no wind. So how could the US flag be waving? Those are just some of the reasons why a group of people believe Apollo 11 was just a trick. Of course, scientists have provided explanations for those questions, but whether NASA really touched the lunar surface or not is still a question. Maybe Armstrong really took one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Maybe it's all fake. Who knows? Okay guys, that's it. I hope you now know why NASA never returned to the moon. Did you find this video helpful? If so, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. And before you leave, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button right there to avoid missing our future videos about science and mysteries. Until next time, guys.